Mending the World, Modern Judaisms. Do you understand all these questions and terms from last time? Define Hellenism, Messiah, Halakha, synagogue, rabbi, kotel, diaspora, Mishnah, and Talmud. What were some questions and new ideas that arose in the Second Temple period? What is the function of the Mishnah and the two Talmuds? What are they doing exactly? Part 1. Medieval Jews under Christianity and Islam. As the history of the Judean diaspora moved on, the Mishnah and the Torah became increasingly important to daily life. The further you got in time, space, language, and culture from the Hebrew Torah, the more you needed to explain how it applied to your daily life. But that begs the question, how far is too far? For most Jews, the answer was that God had intended these kinds of developments from all eternity. Just as the Torah was present in the mind of God before he passed it on to Moses in some distant past, so too did God pass on the means to interpret that revelation. This would be known later as oral Torah, the Torah which people speak. The written Torah was the 5 physical books found in the Hebrew Bible, which contained some of God's message to his chosen people. But there were other opinions and practices which were passed along orally, from generation to generation, from parent to child, and from rabbi to student. These matters, which were not written in the physical Torah, were just as much from God, but they moved amongst the Jews themselves. The Mishnah and the Talmud were just some of this oral revelation that got written down. But the rest of the oral Torah lives with the teachers of the Halakha, acting and reacting to whatever one's day brings. Using the same kind of malleable, adaptive thinking that produced the Mishnah and the Talmud, the descendants of the Judeans, those Jews living in diaspora, continue to survive under pagan Rome. Actually, they didn't do that bad. The Romans had destroyed their temple and put them into diaspora, but truth be told, these were exceptions to the larger rule. These acts were, from a Roman point of view, the result of violent revolts that tried to threaten Roman political power. But the Romans really didn't have any significant issue with the Judean religion. Roman paganism, as paganism tends to do, was generally quite tolerant when it came to other cults and cultures. We have records of pagans who would study under rabbis and give donations for the building of new synagogues. And because the Judeans were usually monotheists, the Romans exempted them from having to offer sacrifice to the imperial gods. With the notable exception of your political beliefs, the Romans really didn't care what people thought or did regarding religion. The Jewish people were no different. But the world changed. 2 new religions appeared, and they replaced paganism forever. The first of these was Christianity. By the early 4th century, Christianity was now the official religion of the Roman Empire, as well as the Aksumite Empire in modern Ethiopia. By the end of the 7th century, Islam became the state religion in the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, and the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal. While there were Jews almost everywhere in all of these places, there were some particularly dense populations, who in a certain way have distinct histories from Jews elsewhere. The official religion, political system, culture, and language of a certain locality would reflect itself onto the local Jewry, the local Jewish community, just as it did to everyone else. For example, One of the first major governments to convert to Christianity as an official state religion was the Aksumite Empire, pre-modern Ethiopia. But there was already a large Jewish community there well before that. Called the Beta Israel, the word in Gai is for the House of Israel, these Jews were both similar to Jews elsewhere, but distinctly Ethiopian. So, for instance, they have a partial translation of the Hebrew Bible in Gaiz called the Orit, the Scripture. It includes only the first 8 books of the Tanakh. They have the rest too, but they were significantly less central to Ethiopian Jews than they were to Jews in other places. In Central Europe, the Jews were called Ashkenazis. They spoke Yiddish, a version of German with a heavy dose of Aramaic and Hebrew. And they were subject to very regular persecution from their Christian rulers, who considered these Jews suspects for both religious and economic reasons. Since the kings of Europe were said to have been appointed by the Christian God, the divine Jesus Christ, subjects that did not believe that Jesus was divine were politically questionable at best. And because European Christians were forbidden by Christian law to lend money at interest, Jews were much more likely to become bankers, merchants, and tax collectors, fueling resentment, stereotypes, and anger. These Jews more often than not were forced to wear clothing that marked them as distinct from Christians, and they very often had to live in isolation too. One of these isolated communities, in Venice, Italy, survives to us in modern English as a byword for a place where a persecuted minority has to live. In Italian, the ghetto. Such Jewish ghettos would cover the European landscape well into the 20th century, and even then, they only ended because of the Holocaust, an issue we're going to return to in a moment. The Jews of the Asian Islamic world, the Persianate lands like Iran, Afghanistan, and the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, Syria, and Iraq, are called Mizrahi, which roughly means Eastern Jews. Things were a bit better for Jews in the pre-modern Islamic world. There were still persecutions and distrust, but it was much more rare in the Islamic world than it was in Christian Europe. First, Islamic law had stipulations for Jewish worship, going all the way back to Muhammad himself. As long as they paid their taxes like everyone else did, they were roughly free to worship, more or less as they pleased. Jews could also participate in government, and even become a member of the caliph's court. And this wasn't that uncommon. But there were Muslims in the West, too. And large Jewish populations lived under Islamic rule there as well. The Iberian Peninsula, our Spain and Portugal, was under some kind of Islamic rulers for almost 800 years, from 711 to 1492. The Jews of these lands were called Sephardis, or Sephardic Jewry. And in the Islamic West, Jews did particularly well for themselves. They were something of a Jewish Renaissance. While most of the Sephardic Jews spoke Arabic and the Proto-Spanish languages, there was also a major revival of Hebrew as a literary language. Hebrew was slowly coming back from the dead. To this day, the most notable poets of the Hebrew language lived in Islamic Spain. There you'll meet poets like Ibn Gabirol, who was on the payroll of several Islamic rulers as a court poet. Ibn Gabirol's longest employment was under Samuel ibn Nagrallah, who was both a rabbi and the prime minister of the Muslim king of Granada. So, in other words, there were Muslim kings who not only patronized Jewish Hebrew poetry, they had Jewish scholars running their government. Now, we should never think of any time or place as a golden age. Every moment in history has problems. But Islamic Spain proved a very fertile ground for many Jews. And it wasn't just poets either. The most famous scholar of the oral Torah who ever lived was also from Islamic Spain. This was Musa ibn Maimun, known to many people today as Maimonides. He was born in Cordoba and wrote his own summary of the Talmud called the Mishneh Torah, which remains the most popular work of oral Torah to come out of the Middle Ages. And he also wrote philosophical defenses of Judaism. Philosophical in the sense that Maimonides was trying to argue that Judaism was a rational scientific religion. The most famous of these defenses was the Guide for the Perplexed. It was written in Arabic, which would have been the most widespread common language for Jews before modern times. And it was a huge bestseller. It still is, by the way. Part 2. How to respond to modernity. Speaking of scientific thought, the modern period, which philosophically minded people like Maimonides foreshadowed, would come to pose a major hermeneutical problem for how Judaism was supposed to be interpreted. We haven't discussed modernity much yet, and we're going to get into it in much more detail later on, but for now, modernity, in a European context, refers to the years roughly between 1500 and 1970. It's a massive category like ancient or Middle Ages, so don't get too stuck on exactly when it began and ended. It's just a label. In the case of Judaism, the big question of modernity involved the introduction of the distinctly modern category of religion. For most of their history, Jews weren't called Jews, and they didn't have a category like Judaism either. They were the tribes of Israel, or the Hebrews, or the Judeans, or the Judaizers. But those are all marks of ethnicity, things like ancestry and culture, language, or homeland. But Judaism, which is a totally modern word, is the name of a religion. Judaism is a belief system and a series of social practices. You can convert to Judaism, but you can't convert to being a Hebrew. Once these people started to be categorized by religion, there was also a counter-development. Once you have the notion of religion, you also have the notion of not religion, the secular. From the Latin meaning worldly, the word secular is something of the negation of an equally modern term, religion. To be secular is to be not religion, and to be religion is to be not secular. So, when these notions both appeared, modern people started asking themselves which human phenomena fit into which category. Was a government secular or religious? Was a certain philosophy secular or religious? Was a certain ritual secular or religious? It isn't always obvious. Just how the exact definition of religion is rather unclear, so is the definition of secular. When applied to the Jewish people, a huge group that's observable both long before modernity began and still exists now in modernity, well, the issue gets rather complicated. For a very simple but very convoluted example, ask, who is a Jew? Now, for all known forms of Judaism, both in the ancient world and today, there are only two ways to be Jewish. You can convert, or you have to be born to a Jewish mother. Now, most Jews for all of history weren't converts, so let's just stick to people who were born Jewish. This is the overwhelming majority. The Hebrew religion passes on matrilineally from mother to children. So even if your father was in no way Jewish, if your mother is, you would be Jewish too. That's because before the modern notion of religion, there was no word for Judaism. There were ethnic terms like Hebrew or Israelite or Judean, and ethnic terms are inherited, right? You inherit your ethnicity. But if Jewish, this modern term, is an ethnic designation, then does it mean people who are of Jewish ancestry but have since converted to another religion, are they still Jewish? Suppose your grandmother was born Jewish but converted to Christianity, and she had a daughter who was raised Christian, and her daughter had you, and you were raised Christian. Now, even though you call yourself a Christian, and your mother called herself a Christian, are you still Jewish? And conversely, if you try to treat Jewish as a modern religious term, you end up with a similar problem. If a Jew is someone who follows the Jewish religion, meaning the beliefs, customs, and morals and rituals of a certain Jewish people, well, then you hit another stumbling block. There are millions of people who would identify themselves as Jews, but live totally secular lives. They may not go to synagogue, or follow halakhic law, or even believe in God, but they still call themselves Jews. Often they'll say secular Jews. This issue of what it means to be a Jew, and how Jewishness fits into the modern dichotomy of religion and secular, are probably the two central questions of modern Judaism, and there are roughly 4 answers to them. The first answer is the one we just met: non-religious or secular Jews. These are people who are born into Jewish families, identify themselves as Jews, but have no other belief, custom, or ritual that marks them as any different from their non-Jewish neighbors. They don't celebrate Jewish holidays or study Torah or believe in any supernatural powers. But they still call themselves Jews. And, according to the most ancient records from rabbinical sources, because they're born to Jewish mothers, they are Jews. They are Jewish no matter what they do or think. What about Jews who think that Judaism behaves like a religion? That not only is there an ethnic component to Judaism, there are thoughts and actions involved too. Let's start with the Haredis. They're sometimes referred to as the ultra-Orthodox, although many Haredis themselves reject that label, so we will too. For them, a Jew has to believe that there is only one God, and that the Torah was given to Moses directly by that God. Moses himself was roughly just a scribe. The Torah is literally and fully the Word of God, eternally true and without fault. Because they interpret the Torah, and hence Judaism, this way, they tend to live in very insular communities. So, even though the old European Jewish ghettos are a thing of the past, Haredis still live in very particular locations, where other Haredis live too. This is both a way to keep the community tight-knit, but it's also a practical measure. For instance, according to the Torah, do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. Well, if you can't light a fire on the Sabbath, you can't start an engine, because that means you just made a spark. So therefore, Haredis can't drive on the Sabbath. But you have to go to synagogue on the Sabbath too. So therefore, if you're a Haredi, you have to live within walking distance of your synagogue. This is why Haredis are usually found in particular communities and not others. They need to cluster not only near each other, but near their place of Sabbath prayer. Haredi men and women must live by roles that are clearly defined by both the written and oral Torah. They sit separately in synagogues. Marriages are quasi-arranged by families. A man must pray 3 times a day. A woman must raise children and keep the home kosher, meaning in accord with halakhic ordinances. Meat and dairy have to be kept apart, they can never touch the same dishes, there are no pork products of any kind, and all meat must be slaughtered according to the instructions of the rabbis. Children attend special religious schools, which are also segregated by gender, and boys usually will go on to yeshiva, a Talmudic school for advanced study. There are also the Hasidic Jews, meaning the pious ones, probably the most distinctive Jewish communities. The Hasidim are spiritual descendants of the teacher Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. The Baal Shem Tov taught that not only must his Hasidim live in communities apart from other people, they must experience a joyful religious ecstasy in their practice. Practices of singing and dancing are expressions of this Hasidic mysticism. By mystically celebrating the Torah and the Holocaust, the Jew's job was to fix the brokenness of this life. Tilkun Alam, as the liturgy taught. Mend the world. Less strict than the Haredis are the many Jewish movements labeled conservative Judaism. The conservative Jews keep adherence to the halakhic practices, but they also take account of modernity and science. This branch of Judaism appeared in the 19th century, when biblical scholars started asking serious questions about the historical legitimacy of the Torah, both written and oral. Scholars of the Hebrew Bible started to conclude that the written Torah was, in truth, a series of heavily edited documents created over centuries, both before and after the Babylonian captivity. It wasn't a single fixed text that was just handed down to Moses in one piece. And so conservative Jews took those arguments seriously. You can't just look at the Torah as a straightforward transcription of God's will. Likewise, not only has the Torah changed, Judaism itself has changed over the millennia. Ancient Judaism wasn't like the Judaism of the Middle Ages, and neither was modern Judaism like either. Therefore, the authority of the Torah doesn't come from the rabbis of old, or even God directly, but rather through living Jews themselves. The interpretation of the Scriptures, the source of truth, is the interpretation of one's personal experience, because personal experience is all you have. So, they have to interpret the written and oral Torah in the light of present knowledge and secular culture. Some of the Torah's mitzvah are binding at all times, while others are only valid in particular historical contexts. Which is debatable. Returning to the example of the Torah's command, do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. The conservative Jews could argue that the point of this command was to avoid work on the Shabbat, which is supposed to be a day of rest. And in the pre-modern world, lighting a fire was certainly work. But it isn't now. Lighting a fire is quite easy. And in fact, it causes even more work if you avoid lighting fires on the Sabbath. Walking to synagogue, if your synagogue was far away, was work, not driving it. Therefore, the conservative Jews could choose to keep walking to synagogue on Sabbath, in keeping with their tradition, which is preferred, or they could jettison the practice and just drive to say their prayers. And because of that, conservative Jews who conclude that it's permissible to drive on the Sabbath can also choose to live anywhere they please. No need to be stuck in a certain Jewish neighborhood. Similarly, ancient notions of gender relationships or very particular styles of food and clothing that are perhaps more damaging to Jews than they are worth could be cast aside by the conservative when they could not by the Haredi. Secular thought, scientific thought, and non-Jewish thought can indeed be helpful to Jewish life and practice. Finally, we meet an even more modernized form of Judaism, the Reform movement. Reform Jews wouldn't even consider walking to synagogue when you can drive easily. Also coming out of the 19th century, like the conservative movement, Reform Jews do not keep traditions which they consider to be out of step with modernity and the larger society. They will say their prayers in the local language, as well as Hebrew, since next to no one understands the Hebrew. They don't want to sacrifice animals in some New Jerusalem temple, but rather they want to worship in ways and settings that are meaningful to people now. This is also why Reformed Jewish houses of worship are called temples, not synagogues. The point of these buildings is to be a place of prayer, not a place for studying outdated documents. Judaism for the Reformed Jew is an ethical ideal, not an unquestioning tradition. It speaks of justice for all people, not just for some small community which they happen to be members of. All the old prohibitions about food, clothing, and the mixing of genders or mixing with non-Jews are irrelevant. The famous Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, a rabbinical document which is something of a foundational treaty of the Reform movement, declares boldly, "We accept as binding only Judaism's moral laws and such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, and reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization." The Reformed rabbis and their followers looked to the biblical prophets of old who called people back to an ethical way of life. They concluded that God wants justice and peace, not divisive traditions that for modernized people don't actually mean anything anyway. Men and women are equal, there are often even female rabbis, there are not infrequently same-sex weddings, or the weddings of Jews to non-Jews. Part 3. The Shoah and the State of Israel. Returning to Jewish communities in Europe. The ghettoization and persecution of European Jewry continued on from the Middle Ages right into the 20th century. This long process culminated in the Holocaust, Greek for the burning, or the sho'ah, Hebrew for the extermination. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany in 1933, in part fueled by anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant, and anti-leftist furor that had been increasing since the middle of the last century. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland and soon thereafter started to invade other nations like Holland, Norway, and most of France. Populations that were considered undesirable, Jews, both ethnic and religious Jews, Romani, gay men, socialists, communists, and many others, were at first restricted to ghettos, and then finally set off to concentration camps. There, they were either worked to death if they were deemed physically fit enough to work, or if they were children, sick, or old, they would often just be executed on arrival. By the time the camps were liberated by Russian and American soldiers in 1945, over 12 million people had died in them. Of that, half, 6 million, were Jews. The death of 6 million Jews in less than 5 years, that's about 1/3 of the Jews on Earth, raised any number of significant questions. Not only was it the immediate horrors of the event, personal shock, genocide, the annihilation of many often ancient Jewish neighborhoods, towns, and villages, and the loss of the survivors' possessions, there was also religious questions that this asked. Could a drastically reduced community survive? What was the relationship of Jews to the modern world, whose industrial efficiency and advanced science actually made this genocide possible? What good are Western values, which are at best a noble lie? What good are halakhic values if so many people who were obedient to their God were not saved from the ghettos and the death camps? Assimilation into European culture didn't work. Modernity didn't work. Tradition didn't work. So, for many of the survivors of the Shoah, a drastic but not entirely new measure was in order. The Jews needed a nation of their own. They needed to save themselves. The Torah is quite explicit that God not only has a fixed relationship with the chosen people, but that God and his people have a similar fixed relationship with their ancestral homeland, and Jerusalem most especially. Later Jews in the modern period understood this relationship in many ways, and they still do. For some, the belief was to be understood symbolically alone, meaning that the Jews are a people in spiritual exile, who therefore have to find a proper home where the Jew can encounter God. In this case, the Jews are a nation in the sense that they are a people. They are the survivors of the tribes of Israel. For others, the belief that God had promised this particular people a holy land was taken more literally. God wanted this particular people, the Jews, to have a particular land. God had led Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and the survivors of the Babylonian captivity to a very fixed area that can be plotted on a map. And in the modern world, controlling a certain area of land means having a nation-state. That is what would be later called the State of Israel. In the wake of the Nazi terror, Many Jews activated this more literal approach to God's promised land, and concluded the only way for Jews to escape such persecution and destruction was to have a nation-state of their own, where they controlled the laws and commanded armies. Jews had to defend themselves from their enemies. This movement was called Zionism. That is, that there is a particular land, home to Mount Zion, that is Jerusalem and the former location of the temples, and it was necessary for Jews to control that land, and therefore their own fates. While there had been Zionists even as far back as the 19th century, after the Holocaust, their cause became much more serious to Jewry worldwide. This isn't to say that all Jews agreed with Zionism, or that all Zionists agree with each other. Many in Haredi circles thought that the Messiah alone could reinstitute the land of Israel, and therefore to try and make a modern Jewish state without such a Messiah appearing was something like an affront to God's own will. On the opposite side, many Reform Jews thought that Jews didn't need to flee to some new country, but rather they needed to come to terms with the world through assimilation. They have to fix the countries they already live in, not make some new one. And as far as the Zionists themselves, there was also tension there. Did the Jewish state have to be literally in Zion? Other locations, like Turkey, the Mediterranean islands, and even Uganda, were actually suggested seriously. But the ancient Jewish homeland, then called Palestine, as it had been called since ancient Roman times, won out. The British Empire controlled Palestine, and they agreed to grant it over, via the newly created United Nations, to make two states. One was to be for the Palestinians, the various Muslims, Christians, and Jews of Arab descent who lived there already. And the other nation was to be for the displaced Jews themselves from anywhere else. The Palestinians rejected the agreement. They had been living there since ancient times, so who was this British Empire or this UN to give half of it away? But the Jews of Europe took the chance and established the modern state of Israel in 1948. The new state of Israel transformed Jewish life around the world, even for those who didn't agree with how the state came into existence. First, Hebrew was revived as a living language for the first time in 2,000 years by blending the biblical language with needed modern terminology from Arabic and also the European languages. Second, the nation of Israel offered the right of return. Anyone from anywhere could, and still can, simply go to the Israeli embassy of their own home country and declare themselves a citizen of Israel, simply because they're Jewish. They needed no other explanation. And as Israel was created by people coming from Europe, it was economically much more affluent than many of its regional neighbors. Therefore, Jewish communities from around the world started to move to Israel, sometimes en masse. This especially included Jews from places that were less friendly to this minority dwelling amongst them, but also applied to many places that were economically impoverished. Yemen, Iraq, and Iran, which had had huge Jewish populations going all the way back to Roman times, now experienced a mass Jewish exodus. The Beta Israel almost entirely left their ancient homeland of Ethiopia. And a third question: is the diaspora over? So much of Jewish history was defined by the Jews as a decentralized people, a people without a homeland who are distant from their God. But now, any Jew on earth could, potentially, move to Israel. Most didn't, of course, and many still have the same serious objections with the Israeli government and its actions. But still, Jerusalem was open to Jews to come and go freely. Therefore, are the Jews still in exile from God? Must more oral Torah appear to address not only modernity and secularism, but also the end of the diaspora? Some more questions. What were the major Jewish groups that lived under Islamic and Christian rule? What are the 4 general Jewish responses to modernity? What is each called? And how does each approach the oral and written Torah? What were the religious effects of the Shoah and the State of Israel?